All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. We do have a full agenda today, committee, and we've got, about 14, I believe, opponents that we're going to start off with today, but I will have, we would be doing 3 minutes on the testimony, and I will start off with Revisor Abbott giving us a brief explanation of the bill.
Should I give him 3 minutes? I think I can handle that. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, committee. Senate Bill 180 would establish the Women's Bill of Rights to provide a meaning of biological sex for the purposes of statutory construction. The bill would create a new section of law. Subsection A of the bill establishes definitions and rules of statutory construction to use when applying an individual's biological sex to state law or rules and regulations adopted by any state agency. The subsection would define sex as an individual's biological sex at birth, either male or female, and would go through specifics of what constitutes a male or female for purposes of this bill. Subsection B sets out the standard of judicial review for state laws and rules and regulations that distinguish between the sexes as being intermediate scrutiny. The bill describes intermediate scrutiny as allowing laws that distinguish between sexes where those distinctions are substantially related to an important governmental interest, and states that distinctions between the sexes related to athletics, prisons, domestic violence shelters, and locker rooms, among others, are substantially related to an important governmental interest to protecting the health, safety, and privacy of individuals in such circumstances. Subsection C of the bill would require that any state agency and any school that collects vital statistics to identify each individual who is a part of the collected data to be identified as either male or female at birth. The bill would take effect upon publication in the statute book, July 1 of this year, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Scott. Committee, are there questions for Revisor Abbott? Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Abbott. I was wondering, is there any precedent for a state specifying the level of judicial scrutiny?
Madam Chair, Representative, I am not aware of any act of a state legislature, a bill that would set forth this level of judicial scrutiny in the bill itself. That's typically a decision made by the courts when they are reviewing a particular bill.
Thank you. And if I may ask a follow-up, is there any broad agreement that the provisions listed under substantially related to important governmental objectives are acknowledged through other precedent? Like, if I may clarify, is there any precedent, federal, state, case law that would define those things that are listed as substantially related to important governmental objectives?
So, Madam Chair, Representative, so I would say it's long-standing precedent that laws that distinguish on the basis of sex are subject to intermediate scrutiny. I would say it's an entirely case-by-case analysis of whether, I think you're referring to those specific instances of prisons, athletics, those types of issues. I would say that's entirely a case-by-case determination by a court looking at a particular question.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Boyd.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Scott, in a couple places in the bill, it talks about separate being not inherently unequal, and it specifically calls out educational spaces. Are those two spaces or those two spots in this bill in conflict with Brown versus the Board of Education?
Madam Chair, Representative, I think it would take kind of a separate analysis to determine whether the rationale in Brown v. Board applies to this particular context. I would agree with you generally that rationale was rejected. The idea of separate but equal was rejected in Brown v. Board in the context of what was at issue in Brown v. Board. I would say it would take a separate analysis to confirm that it would apply to a different context.
I'm sure. So race versus sex, are those the two analyses that you're referring to?
Yes, I would say that. I wouldn't say. The U.S. Supreme Court and Kansas Supreme Court precedent have long held different levels of review for issues of race or other discrimination and laws that distinguish on the basis of sex.
Representative Reese. Is there anyone else who has a question for Revisor Abbott? Representative Orpeza.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is that to the financial report, it did say that there could be possibly legality issues if this were to be passed. Is there any type of financial that you can put on that? Like, how much does that potentially cost?
So, Madam Chair, Representative, are you referring to the fiscal note? Yes. I'm sorry. The revisor's office is not in any way involved in the preparation of the fiscal note. I could not speak to that.
So that wouldn't be a reviser question? All right. Are there any more questions of Revisor Abbott? Seeing none, thank you very much, Scott. We appreciate it. Okay. Now, I have not read through all of the testimony. I have spot checked a few of them. I will highly recommend that if you have chosen to be derogatory or name calling, because I will not tolerate that from committee members, and I do not tolerate it from conferees either. And in discussion with my ranking and my vice chair, we are in full agreement of this. Yes. Correct? So if you want to provide your written testimony because you were scheduled and you have done such things in your testimony, I suggest you ad-lib it. Otherwise, we will cease your testimony at that time. It's about being respectful, because we can all sit in here and have disagreements, but we'll do it respectfully. And for those that have known me for a lot of years, they will find that that's kind of a major pet peeve of mine. So, all right, first conferee I have is Beth Aller. Did I pronounce that correctly? Is Beth here?
Yes.
Virtual?
Yes. Virtual.
Are you with us?
Yes,
Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Aller. It's very close.
Aller. All right, thank you. Well, welcome to committee.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, albeit virtually. My name is Dr. Beth Aller, and I'm a board-certified family physician who's practiced in a rural, underserved community in Kansas for the past 12. Yeah.
Beth, just a moment here, and you may not have heard us. We're going to do 3 minutes on the testimony. Okay, thank you. So go ahead and start your time. We'll start your time now.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
No, that's all right. I didn't know if you'd heard us, and I wanted to make sure that you understood that.
Thank you.
Ready, go.
Well, I'm
Okay,
Dr.
go ahead.
Beth Aller. I'm a board-certified family physician who's practiced in a rural, underserved community in Kansas for the past 12 years. My husband is also a family physician, and we're raising 4 children in Kansas. Though those who have introduced this cut and paste bill may not have a great understanding of the science of gender or sex, I hope that by providing information today, others in the legislature will take the opportunity to set a better example and we can educate ourselves. For decades, scientists and physicians have agreed that there's no sufficient way to define what makes someone a woman and that there's a myriad of variation. No true physician or scientist would claim to be able to distill the intricacies of this into a simple binary. Now, I know that many authors of the bill and supporters want to hear and what makes people comfortable. They want to hear that biological sex is black and white and that there is a simple gender binary. However, the idea of a gender binary is not scientifically or medically correct. Gender cannot be binary because it is a personal identity and socially constructed. Sex, which refers to one's biological characteristics, also exists as a spectrum because intersex people exist. We cannot erase or overlook their existence because it doesn't fit into the picture of a binary that many prefer. Now, it is true that sex and gender do tend to be bimodal, but not binary. This means that sex characteristics do tend to cluster into those associated with what people conventionally call male or female. But there are many, many examples where this isn't the case. Perhaps the simplest way to begin to explain it is to discuss that in our bodies, there are at least 10 different biological markers of sex. Chromosomes, gonads, hormones, secondary sex characteristics, external genitalia, internal genitalia, gene expression, brain structure, and hormone receptor sensitivity. And none of those 10 is strictly dichotomous. The different markers do not always align. Now, intersex is not a social construct or a gender identity. It is a biological configuration where a body has both male and female features, making it difficult to determine sex based on chromosomes or simple examination. It's estimated that babies with intersex traits account for up to 2% of live births, which may not seem like many. But ask yourself, do you know someone with red hair? I would wager that you do, and redheads make up about 2% of the population. Now, as the mother of 2 redheads and a physician, I'm aware of how many people 2% can represent. And this 2% of people deserve to be seen and acknowledged. The biology can be complex, and I laid out many examples in my written testimony that I hope you'll take time to read, describing the over 15 different sex chromosome combinations that we only currently know of. As only one example, I'd like to say XY gonadal dysgenesis, otherwise known as Swyer syndrome. Persons have an XY or a male chromosome pattern, but develop female reproductive organs, including a uterus and a vagina. However, they lack ovaries. So how would you classify this person or define their sex? If you say by chromosomes, then they're XY or a male. But if by external genitalia, then they have a vagina and would thus define as female. If you say gonads or gametes, then their sex is undefined. So which do you use, and how are you going to classify them in a bill like this? Do they get the rights and protections this bill claims or not? And can you see the difficulty in just this one example? And this hasn't even touched on the harm this would do to transgender persons. So while we can attempt to make a so-called standard for legal classification, we can't legislate away science. This bill does nothing to make me, my daughters, or my patients safer, but it does state to do a group of persons already at a greater risk of violence and discrimination.
Beth, your time is up.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right, next committee, we have Laura Crow, private citizen. Welcome to committee, Laura.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. My name is Laura Crow, as stated. My legal name, however, is Larry Crow. I am one of the 2% you just heard about. And I did not know this fully until 2020 when everyone else was dealing with the pandemic. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I am a Kansan since age 1. Went to Goddard High School, Newman University, and got multiple bachelor's degrees there. Went to Washburn Law School and got multiple certificates there. Have been in practice since 2009, both at the federal district and also the Kansas Supreme Court level. I have been in private practice ever since, and then also I've been in-house counsel for multiple multinational companies, including being one of the youngest general counsels in the country at age 27. I was also have multiple published patents, and I currently work for a global pharmaceutical company that is actually outside of this state with no physical presence here, and my salary comes in through me working from my home office. I have also served for multiple boards around for nonprofits. I have a small nonprofit / pro bono / low profit law firm for people in Kansas. And I also own my own business with my wife that is a bookstore in Hutchinson, Kansas. So as a proud member of the state, I felt like I should probably come up here and talk a little bit. I won't go through the stats other than to add one piece to what Dr. Beth said, which is that if you do the numbers for our population, that's about 60,000 Kansans. Actually, it's 57,900. But for statistics purposes, roughly there's 728 cities in this state and towns. Only 7 of the cities have a larger population than that. So we could literally have the whole city of Hutchinson be intersex. And that's the type of numbers we're talking about. So as a lawyer, I look at definitions. And the definitions here, quite frankly, exclude me from law. As the doctor had mentioned that there isn't a binary, and I'm proof of that. I am one of the few people you'll probably ever hear say that I've had 3 puberties in my life. I had my first puberty when I was 9, and I started developing female characteristics. By 13, additional medical intervention came up, and that was my biology was changed again, or at least my parts. Functionally, my body cannot produce ova or semen. I literally have none of the parts to do so. I had a uterus. It was removed when I was 6. I have gonads, but I don't have some of the other parts. From that perspective, of the 10 she referenced, my brain scans look female. My hormones are that of a standard woman, actually much, much higher. And I also, my external as well, does not fit the profile. As a lawyer, I look at this and say, what do I do?
Laura, time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I have Tammy Quayle. Welcome to committee, Tammy.
Good afternoon, members of the committee, and thanks for letting me have the opportunity to speak. My name is Tammy Quayle. I am from Wichita. I have a transgender daughter, and I am here to defend her and the 2% of the population that is transgender. Their safety and ability to live and remain in Kansas is in jeopardy, and that is why I am in opposition to SB 180. My husband and I have 3 kids in college. We are cradle Catholics. We went to Catholic schools and Catholic universities. Our children attended Catholic schools as well. We believe all of our children are a gift from God and are wonderfully and beautifully made by their Creator. Our transgender child is no exception. She is transgender, but that is one facet of her. She is accomplished, intelligent, compassionate, friendly, human, deserving of dignity and protection under Kansas law. SB 180 seeks to define and codify a strict gender binary so that discriminatory laws, can be passed based on it. Not everyone will fit into the binary, and that is by the author's design. The writers of this bill are from outside special interest groups, and on their webpage boast how they've created this model legislation and are pushing their harmful anti-transgender agenda via this bill to other states as well. Kansas is just one of the targets. SB 180 is getting attention nationally. Last week, a media host praised Kansas SB 180 because it would, quote, ban transgenderism for all practical purposes in the state. Emboldened by SB 180's language, this same host spoke at CPAC this weekend and told the audience transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. SB 180 is part of a concerted effort by these groups with an agenda, the eradication of transgender people. SB 180 would like to codify into law a gender binary, and those who do not fit into it should be removed. Kansas, we can't let this happen on our watch. SB 180's intended consequence would have transgender people staying out of public spaces. My daughter couldn't use the bathroom. She couldn't in public spaces. She couldn't go to a museum, a ballpark, a restaurant if she can't use the bathroom. How is she supposed to work if she can't use the bathroom during an 8-hour shift? I fear that what this bill seeks to do is to keep transgender people out of the public eye by limiting their access to the most basic of necessities, a bathroom that matches their gender. Walking by the mural of John Brown today, I am reminded of our proud history. Kansas, we take great pride in being known as the Free State. Over 160 years ago, we stood up for the freedom and dignity of all people. We find ourselves again at a time when protecting those rights of all are at stake. I'm asking you to take a stand again. Take a stand with me. Vote no on SB 180. Thank you for your time.
All right, thank you very much. You did excellent. You were almost on the dot there. Next, I have Jay Bohannon. Did I pronounce that correctly, Jay? All right. Welcome to committee.
Good afternoon. My name is Jay Bohannon. I am currently the Secretary of the Mid-America LGBT Chamber, where I serve as on the Board of Directors. I am also a lifelong Kansan, born and raised in Wichita, and currently living in Leawood, Kansas. And in addition to that, I'm also a trans man. I stand here today in opposition of SB 180 because I believe it has unintended consequences in addition to not protecting women. If this bill were to pass, it would start and ignite more laws to come that will simply place the burden of our sex-assigned at birth, which will determine behaviors that we have in this state. For those of you who support this bill, I ask you, do you want me in the women's restroom? I am a person who was born and still has a vagina, uterus, and ovaries. If this law passes and more laws come that determine that we have to use the bathroom based on our sex assigned at birth, that means I would have to use the women's restroom. This doesn't protect women, and in fact makes them uncomfortable. And I can tell you early in my transition from my own experiences, it means I'll be harassed in the bathroom. It also means I'll have to tell everyone that 1, I have a vagina, and 2, I'm trying to follow the law. Because if this law passes and other laws follow, I will use the women's restroom. Why? Because as a black man in this country, I have no interest in going to jail. So I will be using the women's restroom, which does not help anyone. As the woman before me spoke, we have a mural, the prelude to the tragedy of John Brown. John Brown did not fight to make this a free state for us to now humiliate and dehumanize our fellow Kansans. This state was born on not only making it a free state, but so that everyone could come here and be equal. Our state's history is to let everyone in. Now is not the time to tarnish that legacy. Moreover, members, I urge you to vote no, because this bill is not great for Kansas. I urge you to allow us to continue to rise to the stars, as our great state motto says, and not allow us to fall into the likes of, say, Missouri or other states that we try so hard to distinguish ourselves from. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Ladies, I would ask that you not sit on those cabinets back there. They're not made for that, please. Thank you very much. Well, we've had problems where they've actually folded on us, so. All right, next I have Ellen Bertels. Did I pronounce that correct, Ellen? Bertels? Bertel. All right, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ellen Bertels. I am a lifelong Kansan, but I live in Wichita now. I'm an attorney with Kansas Legal Services. Through a Skadden Fellowship, I provide free legal representation to low-income transgender Kansans seeking name changes and gender marker changes. I'm testifying today because SB 180 will have profound negative consequences for my clients and other trans Kansans like them. SB 180 is harmful for many reasons, as you've heard already, but I'd like to focus on the fact that it essentially bans gender marker changes on state-issued identity documents like birth certificates and driver's licenses. This bill requires that state agencies adopt a definition of gender that excludes trans and intersex Kansans because it adopts an overly narrow definition of gender. By saying that vital records must reflect a person's sex assigned at birth, this bill makes it impossible for trans folks to change the gender marker on their state-issued identity documents. This means that they can't obtain IDs that reflect their true identities. Statistics show that legislation like this is extremely harmful to trans folks. When trans people are not able to get correct identity documents, they are more likely to experience harassment, discrimination, and violence at the hands of others. Additionally, this bill is also likely unconstitutional. For more than a decade, Kansas had a policy banning gender marker changes on state-issued identity documents like birth certificates and driver's licenses. In 2019, in a case called Foster v. Anderson, the federal court in Kansas found this policy position, unconstitutional in violation of the U.S. Constitution's 14th Amendment equal protection and due process clauses. Kansas is currently bound by a consent decree that says that the state will not ban gender markers on these state-issued vital records. SB 180 likely violates this consent decree and will drag the state into more expensive, wasteful, and time-consuming litigation. In short, SB 180 denies trans Kansans full recognition under law and is likely to drag Kansas into needless litigation on a fact where this policy has already been found unconstitutional less than 4 years ago. I ask you to take these things into consideration when deliberating on this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great time. Caroline Dean, Kansas Interfaith Action. Welcome to committee.
Thank you for your time today. My name is Reverend Caroline Dean. I am a pastor in the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference of the United Church of Christ, and I'm also speaking on behalf of KIFA, Kansas Interfaith Action, a statewide multi-faith issue advocacy organization that partners with several Christian denominations, as well as Jewish and Muslim Kansans. As a Christian, as a pastor, as a leader in our communities, as a woman and a mother of daughters, I urge you to oppose SB 180. This bill is a part of an ongoing legislative effort to target transgender individuals, including the sports bill and gender-affirming health care bill. Numerous pastors and colleagues across the state have submitted testimony against these bills because we oppose the victimization of trans people. To be clear, these are members of our communities, our congregations, colleagues, friends, and family members. Many of us grew up in a time when we didn't have access to the trans experience, and that has changed. Now we have more access to people whose gender identities don't sync up with the identity given to them at birth. As a pastor, I am the pastor of folks in my own congregation to transgender youth and individuals and family members. Someone transitioning to become a woman does not threaten me or take away any of my rights. There's no professional opportunity or other opportunity that would be taken away from me. No spaces I wouldn't be grateful to share with a trans woman. The irony of this so-called Women's Bill of Rights is that it doesn't actually enumerate any rights. Instead, it weaponizes the rhetoric of rights to erase protections for trans people. I can name some of the rights that women need: the right to pay equity, the right to be free of gendered violence and sexual discrimination, the right to affordable health care and child care, the right to bodily autonomy. None of these actual rights are in this so-called Women's Bill of Rights. As a female pastor, I've been in spaces where I was unwelcome. I've carved out paths on my own. I'm here to shine my gifts, to make the world a better place. Please allow our trans friends and neighbors and youth to be a part of our community, to share their gifts and to thrive. This makes us safe, not spending time on who goes to the bathroom where. Members of the committee, women need our rights protected. We don't need our rights weaponized as an attack against trans people. Please visit with your children, grandchildren, colleagues, neighbors, friends in the LGBTQ community. Ask them how this bill will impact them, how it will impact the suicide rates of trans youth and violence rates against the trans community. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Next, I have Suzanne Wheeler, LGBT Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name's Suzanne Wheeler. I'm a diehard Kansan whose mother's family were original old settlers and longtime business owners in Olathe, Kansas. I'm a business executive, chamber leader, wife, mother of 4 successful children, grandma, and a retired Army colonel who happened to be the full-time director of operations for the Kansas National Guard when I retired. I'm not sure if I should tell you my gender identity. I'm in debate about whether I should trust you with that or not. I'm here to oppose SB 180 and share my disappointment that supporters of this bill are bent on putting their biases ahead of the well-being of our state. As the executive director of the Mid-America LGBT Chamber of Commerce, I represent 487 business members, some of whom are the largest employers in Kansas. I also represent growing industries like biotechnology, information technologies. We have over 247,000 employees represented in the state of Kansas by our chamber. We oppose this blatant attack on transgender women and transgender individuals in our state shrouded in the guise of protecting women. A quick internet search of women attacked by transgender people results in no stories on reported attacks. Instead, that search is going to be met with a litany of stories about the fact that 1 in 2 transgender women will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime, and that transgender women and non-binary individuals suffer from an epidemic of violence against them, driven by myth, misinformation, and bills like SB 180. Our members challenge you to do your research on the bills that will protect Kansas women from the significant rates of violence they experience domestically and in their work environments, not bills that are made up or that address made-up dangers in bathrooms and do nothing to protect women. Workforce development is key to our state. I have not talked to one person in this building who does not agree with that. 7.1% of the next generation workforce identify as LGBTQ+. The same policies indicate that 71% of Gen Z make choices based on how LGBTQ people are treated. I often hear folks from the universities and businesses leaders lament that they can't keep their LGBT graduates here in Kansas because of the stunts that are often pulled in this building. As a military business axiom, I learned early on often that don't make rules that you can't enforce. Ultimately, all I'm going to say is all my legal identity you're not going to be able to tell.
Thank you very much. Next, I have Eileen Berquist, ACLU of Kansas. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Chair. Members of the committee, my name is Eileen Berquist, and I am Policy Director at the ACLU of Kansas. I am a lifelong Kansas. I grew up in rural Saline County, and I am proud that I am here today standing up for my fellow LGBTQ Kansas community. The ACLU of Kansas stands strongly opposed to SB 80 and urges you not to vote this bill out of committee. While SB 80 is framed as a bill protecting women's rights, it does no such thing. Instead, it attempts to codify into law outdated, inaccurate, and under-inclusive definitions of sex and tries to absolve the state of any responsibility to not discriminate against transgender individuals. And at its core, SB 180 attempts to remove trans people's ability to live a public life. By trying to codify into law a right to exclude trans people from athletics, restrooms, locker rooms, domestic violence shelters, and other necessary spaces. Not only is this bill a blatant attempt to marginalize our trans family, it encroaches on the power of the courts in an attempt to do so. The reviser said as much in his response to the representative's question. Separation of powers exists for a reason, and it is a foundational concept of our democracy. This bill, however, attempts to usurp the judiciary's role in analyzing the legality of legislation. The courts have authority to determine if legislation is constitutional, not the legislature. Regardless of what this bill is purported to do if passed, its effect would allow rampant discrimination against transgender people and would cause the erasure of intersex and other gender diverse individuals who exist and who have always existed. And the research shows that when bills like this are introduced and debated, it negatively impacts the mental health of trans youth and other people in our state. I will beg you not to pass this.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Taryn Jones, Equality Kansas. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, committee members. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My name is Taryn Jones, and I am a lifelong Kansan and the lobbyist for Equality Kansas. I am here to testify in opposition to SB 180. SB 180 talks about the differences between men and women, saying that men are on average stronger than women. I honestly find this offensive. There are many female athletes who are stronger than male athletes. I feel in this bill and others like it, there's this idea of fairness and an equal playing field. However, there can never be a truly equal playing field. My cousin is a cisgender woman. She's 6 feet tall. Should she not be allowed to play in sports because that would give her an advantage? We are all built differently regardless of gender. The hard truth is sometimes that gives us an advantage over others. SB 180 also erases intersex people. I'm not going to go into the details of intersex people since a lot of other people have done that. But with 2% of the population, you likely know someone who is intersex. This bill harms intersex people as much as trans people. SB 180 is blatant discrimination of the trans and intersex communities. While I am not trans or intersex, I can say that standing here day after day listening to members of my community get attacked is soul-sucking and gut-wrenching. I can't imagine how this feels for them. Getting up every day and hearing legislators say hateful things about them just for existing. It's no wonder that LGBTQ youth have a suicide rate of 45%. This is why I'm asking you to vote no on SB 180. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I have Liz. Is it Hamor? Is Liz with us? Is she virtual? No?
Chair, I'm sorry. It looks like she didn't make it.
Okay.
But her written testimony was in on time if you wanted to.
Right. Thank you very much. Okay. Next, we have Jerry Hinn, Assistant Executive Director, USA Kansas, and the Kansas Superintendents Association. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Chair Landwehr. I appreciate the opportunity to speak before this committee. It's the first time I've had an opportunity to speak in front of this committee, so I appreciate that very much. I am Jerry Hinn. I'm with USA Kansas, United School Administrators of Kansas, and we represent the school administrators in the state of Kansas. And it seems kind of odd that we'd be at this committee testifying in this situation, but we just want you to know that we're here to support all kids, and it does not make any difference what comes to our schools, what our kids are in as far as religion, sex, you name it. Makes no difference. We want to educate all students so that we can provide productive citizens in the state of Kansas and move them out and help all of us do our jobs. One thing I think that I found important as I started looking through different items on this is that there are at least 13 states in the United States that allow an X on the birth certificate. That may be more than that, but that was what I could find at that on my research, which I find that very interesting. We could certainly do that in Kansas. Even more states support students and parents who are struggling with gender identification. The other thing that I wanted to say, too, is that it makes no difference whether we're Democrats, Republicans, or independents. When we have homeless people, we try to pass laws for getting people off the streets homeless. We try to pass laws to stop poverty. We know that that's not successful. We know that. Why would we try to pass a law that would do away with transgender? That doesn't make sense to us in the education world. Let's work with everybody so that we can help and take care of everybody. As a prior conferee made the comment about suicides, that's a huge issue that we are concerned about for our students. We don't want that to be the issue. This bill is not going to solve the problem. We need to solve this problem that we are talking about today is going to take education, and we need to work with our students to make sure we get those educational opportunities to them. The other thing there's a couple more items that I want to say, and one thing about this committee, it's in itself. You have passed wonderful propaganda laws. Let's change that back to laws that have supported the people in Kansas through your health and social and emotional background. I applaud you on that. This looks like it may be going a step in the wrong direction. So think about that. And then you have a sign in the basement in this building that happened in 1859 that's in our Constitution, and all it simply says is all political power is inherent in the people. And I just want you to think about that as you listen to the rest of the conferees.
Time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have Michelle McCormick, Executive Director, Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. Welcome to committee.
Good afternoon, committee members. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Michelle McCormick, the Executive Director of the Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, where I've been in that role for an entire 2 weeks. But I recognize many of you from my previous roles, as I've been a victim advocate in our state for almost 25 years. And so I'm here to tell you that our member programs have some concerns about the bill, and I'm going to focus specifically on one item in particular, and that is how we're concerned about the potential impact on the federal funding that Kansas domestic violence and sexual assault centers receive. You'll see in my written testimony that I specifically focus on a number of the federal acts, but essentially the Kansas programs, when we agree to take the federal grant dollars, which are critical for our operation, we agree to comply with federal non-discrimination requirements, including those related to gender and gender identity. And so my concern is that if SB 180 were to pass, that it certainly create create some uncertainty for us about whether or not we can comply with those federal rules and then potentially put that funding in jeopardy. And so I wanted to bring that forward to you. Specifically, the Department of Justice provides our agency some guiding documents, and I wanted to note to you that it specifies that survivors, the people who are the beneficiaries of our programs, are to be served by the services that corresponds to the gender in which the beneficiary identifies. And so specifically, the Violence Against Women Act uses the definitions of gender identity. It borrows from the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Hate Crime Prevention Act, and specifically states that gender identity is a person's individual internal view of their gender, which might be different from an individual's gender assigned at birth. And so those are the guiding documents that the Department of Justice says our programs have to follow. And so we're concerned that at best this creates uncertainty about whether or not we can comply, and at worst it puts our programs in direct conflict with being able to comply, which could potentially put our funding in jeopardy. And so I wanted to point that out. And VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, is just one of those federal acts that guide our programs that receive funding. I would also encourage you to look up the Family Violence Prevention Services Act and the Victims of Crime Act, which also have similar non-discrimination requirements. So KCSDV opposes this bill not only for that reason, but I just want to also share with you that KCSDV and our member programs should be considered subject matter experts on the safety of girls and women and all survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence. And when I surveyed our member programs about the potential impact of this bill on our programs, none of them were consulted. We weren't consulted about this bill and the potential impact of including domestic violence centers and rape crisis centers in this. And you have my written testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I have Barbara Williams. Welcome to committee, Barbara.
Oh, I'm feeling short again today, sorry. I'm opposed to SB 180. And a few weeks ago, when I listened to the discussion in the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee on Senate Bill 180, I did not hear anything about women's rights, my rights. Did I miss something? No, I did not. I would suggest that the senator who introduced SB 180 let everyone know that her true intentions.
Barbara?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Unless you know that individually personally, I don't think that you can state that.
All right, we'll strike that from the record.
As I started out earlier, I don't like the name calling.
That's not name calling. There's evidence.
Ma'am,
yes,
if you want to give your testimony.
Yes, ma'am.
You can ad-lib it. I have read your testimony.
Yes, ma'am.
As has my vice chair and my ranking member to my right here. And it would be best if you ad-lib what you have and not read what's written, please.
All right. Well,
I want to give everyone the opportunity to be heard, but I'm just not going to have disrespect in here.
Well, I'm not sure it's disrespect. I disagree with you, but thank you for your feedback. So I'll just say generally, white women in the history of the United States are often remembered anymore as using themselves as instruments of terror. And this phrase is borrowed from Charles Blow, who so aptly here described white women as continuously throughout our history have gone after our most vulnerable populations. So we are talking about a vulnerable population here with trans women. And we can see that if we look back in history, that this is just another example of bigotry. And that this history includes the woman who made accusations against Emmett Till that caused his murder. This includes the history of young white women who harassed Ruby Bridges for wanting an education. It also includes on that list of white women Anita Bryant, who said that homosexuals cannot reproduce, so they must recruit. And to freshen the ranks, they must recruit the youth of America. So these are examples, again, of white women in the history of America attacking vulnerable communities. We are able to recognize that white American men in our history, that they made policies that harm minority populations, but today we also need to recognize that white women are part of the problem here, wanting to make new policies that push harm against a vulnerable population. I hope you will all consider that this is a trend in American history, and we do not want to repeat it. We want to include and be respectful and love everyone in the state of Kansas. It's not that hard. All right, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, committee, that concludes our opponent testimony at this time. I'll be happy to entertain questions from the committee members. Any questions for any of our opponents? Representative Orpeza. No statements, questions, please.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. I had one question for Michelle McCormick. And I know you've only been doing this 2 weeks, so I'm hoping you can give me.
Something tells me she's up to the challenge. She's very good at what she does.
How much potential funding, what are we talking? Money-wise?
Yeah, it's my understanding that the Department of Justice provided Kansas domestic and sexual violence programs $14 million last year, and that's at the average that we receive yearly and that's through the pass-through grants that go through the Governor's Grants Office. That does not include any funding dollars that the programs apply directly. They can apply directly to the federal government as well, so that number could be higher.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Haswood.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Dr. Oler.
Yes.
Thank you for testifying today. So when I read the bill, and this is talking about biological at birth, and then it goes into the definition of female is to produce develop to produce ova. A male would be defined as developing to fertilize the ova, and a biological birth, and we're putting down the gender. To my understanding, it's the observation of a vagina and penis of the newborn. How would we, the definition goes into this, where the person's reproductive system would need to be developed, and what if that biological sex that's indicated, their reproductive system does not develop to fertilize the ova, or the ovaries are not developed properly? Can you, I was just trying to get this understanding in my head. Can you help me as a physician?
Yeah, and that's exactly what's difficult in intersex children, and why in general it is now recommended that you do not do anything drastic to make those decisions until the child is quite a bit older, because we can be wrong based on what it looks like simply externally. If you look in my written testimony, it talks a lot about people who are 46XY, which seems like that's supposed to be a normal, sex development characteristic traits. However, in those, you can have several different issues where people present either externally as females or as males, and they can have an entirely different internal reproductive system appearance than an external one. And just like in Swyer syndrome that I told you about, they have the XY or male chromosome pattern, but they have female reproductive organs if you come to a uterus or a vagina. But in this bill, for example, it talks about being able to produce an ova. They don't have any gametes, the ability to produce gametes, because they don't have gonads that are developed. So where would you put them? Because technically they don't meet any of those. There are also women who are X0 or known as X0, which is Turner syndrome. They will present often as a female, but they also generally don't have the ability to reproduce or make ova. So this is just a very oversimplified definition of sex sex and gender, and it's simply not that simple. And I think one of the other questions is if the legislature is looking into this, the people that need to be making these decisions, it's a lot of people. It's the physicians, it's endocrinology, it's genetics. There's a lot of things that go into these definitions, and it can't be simplified down to something you can legislate. And in the testimony when this was in the Senate, somebody had said, well, intersex people should be given a case-by-case ability to go against this or to say who they are. Who's going to be responsible for that? Because in my eyes, it should be the patient and their physician.
Thank you. And I guess for me, it says, like manifest prior to birth. How would we inspect newborns that they have their reproductive systems and they work, which is kind of where I'm stuck on. But thank you.
Yeah. And no, you can't. You're right. Because as one of the other people discussed, there are times when you have you start to develop certain sex characteristics, and then that changes as different genetic things are in there. And in my testimony, I speak about the development of the genes and how they affect things, not only in development in vitro or when they're inside the mom, but also once they're outside of the body. So this is a complex interplay and not as simple as something you could just determine either prior to birth or as a newborn.
Representative Boyd.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is for Michelle. Thank you for your testimony, and sorry for the 2 weeks. But there's some language in this bill, in my opinion, that alludes to the fact that men are prone to violence and sexual violence. Are males victims of violence, domestic violence, sexual violence? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Certainly, yeah. And I can tell you that the CDC collects a lot of data about this, and I think that people would be surprised. But I think the most recent research that I've seen, that 1 in 4 women experience domestic violence over their lifetime, but 1 in 7 men do. And certainly we know that there are male survivors of sexual violence as well. In fact, male and female children, folks of all gender identities tend to experience childhood sexual abuse at the same rates. And then we do start to see a split as people age, and it does sort of differentiate. But certainly folks of all gender identities experience domestic and sexual violence.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Next I have Representative Blex, and that'll be our final question on opponents.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is for Dr. Beth Oliphant. I hope I didn't mispronounce that.
It's Aller.
Okay, sorry about that. What amount of time is required for you? You said you need some more time to determine sex. So there's some other things that may come in here. What is an average time that you would estimate that to put something on say a birth certificate?
For an intersex child, that would be something that I would recommend not doing until you would get an expert consensus that says they feel calm and comfortable with what that would be. But I would also say, in this case, states such as our state should have the ability to put no gender down, because that might be something that the patient also themselves needs to have say in. If it's an intersex child like the one we talked about in Swyer syndrome, where you could say one thing from their genetics, but another thing from their external sex characteristics, then I think it's only fair to say that that person is the person who gets to determine what gender it is that they are. So that ability to say no gender is very important.
I'm sorry. I'm a wildlife biologist by training, and it's pretty basic to me. And I guess a question, have you put down on in the past as a doctor, say in the last 5 years, I'm assuming you've put sex down at the time of birth. I mean, it seems like we've went along forever, and then all of a sudden we're having some problem identifying what should be basic to me.
I have also put no sex down because I've had a patient that was 47XXY. So what would you like for me to put down for them? Or the patient who's 48XXYY or 49XXYYY. So for those patients, what would you like for somebody to put down? So it's not that simple. I know it's comfortable for it to be simple. And I know, like we said, most are bimodal, but not binary.
Thank you.
All right, committee, that concludes our, just a moment here. All right, this concludes our opponent testimony, and now we will open up for our proponents. And our first proponent we have is Riley Gaines, spokesman, Independent Woman's Voice. Welcome to committee, Riley.
Thank you, Chairwoman Landwehr, and distinguished members of the House Health and Human Services Committee. My name is Riley Gaines, and I'm here today as a spokesman for Independent Women's Voice, and I urge you to pass Senate Bill 180, the Kansas Women's Bill of Rights. Prior to joining IWV, I was a member at the University of Kentucky women's swim team, where I was a 12-time NCAA All-American and 2-time Olympic trial qualifier. Last year in March, my teammates and I were forced to compete against biological male Leah Thomas. Thomas was allowed to compete in the women's division after competing as a member of the University of Pennsylvania's men's swim team for 3 years, where at best was ranked 462nd in the men's category. I can wholeheartedly attest to the tears from the 9th and 17th place finishers who missed out on being named an All-American by 1 place. And I can wholeheartedly attest to the extreme discomfort in the locker room when you turn around and there's a 6'4" biological male who's fully intact with male genitalia watching you undress. We watched in dismay as Thomas swam to a national title that first day in the 500 freestyle, beating out the most impressive and accomplished female swimmers in the country, including 3 Olympians and American record holders. When I raced Thomas the next day in the 200-yard freestyle, it resulted in a tie down to the 100th of a second. Upon tying, the NCAA took us back behind the podium and said, "Great job, you guys tied. Thomas gets the trophy, and Thomas has to have the trophy for photo purposes. Riley, you will go home empty-handed, and Thomas will take the trophy home." But in addition to being forced to give up our awards, our titles, and our opportunities, we were also, as female swimmers, forced to share a locker room with Thomas. Again, a 6'4", 22-year-old biological male equipped with and exposing male genitalia. Let me be clear. We were not forewarned, and we were not asked for our consent on this arrangement, and we did not give our consent. Not so long ago, a decision by a university would have been considered discriminatory and would have been understood as an obvious violation of Title IX, the law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in education, including college athletics. But today, unelected bureaucrats want to redefine sex and equate it to gender identity. But under this rewording, colleges and universities would be required to allow anyone who identifies as a woman to compete in women's sports and undress in female changing spaces. This is literally the opposite of what Title IX would do. It would also mean that men could live in a dorm room with women, men could join sororities. It would actually be sexual harassment to misgender one of these transgender individuals, but it's not sexual harassment for them to be exposing their genitalia in a women's locker room. But what can states do to prevent unelected bureaucrats and judges from unlawfully turning statutes intended to protect women into statutes that discriminate against women? They can start by passing the Women's Bill of Rights to preserve integrity of statutes, again, passed to protect women and protect your legislative prerogatives. Senate Bill 180 does not change any existing laws. It merely establishes a legal definition of sex-based terms, so we're all speaking a common language when it comes to the implementation of laws that are already on the books. SB 180 is a declaration that words matter and that biology matters and that science matters and that when it comes to privacy and safety, separating the sexes is not only constitutional, it's common sense. SB 180 won't stop this legislature from passing laws to accommodate and protect trans-identified individuals, but it will prevent bureaucrats and judges from erasing women's statutory rights. I urge you to pass Senate Bill 180, and I thank you for hearing my testimony.
Thank you very much, Riley. I appreciate it. Next, I have Hadley Heath Manning, Vice President of Policy, Independent Women's Voice. And I believe you're virtual.
I am virtual. Thank you for having me.
All right.
Thank you, Chairwoman and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Hadley Heath Manning, and I'm here today as Vice President for Policy for Independent Women's Voice, and I'm urging you to pass SB 180, the Kansas Women's Bill of Rights. I have submitted written testimony, and I practiced to be sure that I could read that testimony in 3 minutes, but I'm not going to read it today. Instead, I'm going to ad-lib my testimony, not because I would call anyone names, but because I'm saddened to hear so many misperceptions about the Women's Bill of Rights today, and I'd like to set the record straight. So first, people with differences of sexual development comprise between 0.02 and 0.1% of the population. Being intersex or having a DSD condition is not the same as being transgender. The overwhelming majority of people who identify as transgender are not intersex and do not have DSD. Now, even though people with DSD conditions and transgender people comprise a small fraction of the population, that doesn't mean that they don't matter. And I agree that every person, regardless of race, sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity or medical condition deserves equal dignity and respect in our society. People with DSD, because they have a medical condition, they must be accommodated by law under the federal ADA and other state laws. People with medical conditions must be accommodated. Importantly, Women's Bill of Rights doesn't change current law. This is another misperception that I've heard. The WBOR doesn't remove anyone from society or public life. It simply fortifies current law in order to protect women's safety, privacy, and equal opportunity. The WBOR does not prevent legislatures from enacting new laws accommodating people who identify as transgender or making previously single-sex spaces co-ed. That is your prerogative as legislators. But the WBOR will prevent unelected judges or bureaucrats from making those decisions for you. The WBOR forces legislatures to deal with some of the questions that we've wrestled with today, as we've heard from other testimony, to face those things head on. We don't want to go back and change the meaning of words and laws that already exist. I also heard a reference earlier to Brown versus Board of Education, and I wanted to clarify that our legal system sees race and sex differently. Of course, we all know that race and sex are different, and because those characteristics are different, we have different levels of legal scrutiny that we apply to racial discrimination and sexual discrimination. Obviously, there are situations where when it comes to sex, women can only have fair and equal opportunities. They can only have safety and privacy when men and women are segregated or separated. That's very different from the racial context. And just as race and sex are different, so are sex and gender identity different. I also want to clarify that no one from our organization said that transgenderism should be eliminated or exterminated or whatever the misattributed quote was. There was a man at CPAC named Michael Knowles who said something like this, but he has no affiliation with our organization. We want to make room for everyone in our society, and we want to protect the rights that women have had. We want to fortify the legal precedent that has been set that women have fought so hard for in this country in order to have equal opportunity, safety, and privacy. Last thing I'll say is that 80% of Kansans say that Kansas should pass a law defining simple sex-based terms such as man, woman, male, and female. And because the WBOR preserves but doesn't change the current laws regarding sex and sex discrimination, it is nonpartisan. So we have women's advocacy groups from across the ideological spectrum supporting this legislation, and members of this body from both sides of the political aisle can and should support it too. It's common sense, and I wish it wasn't necessary, but it is today. So thank you for hearing my testimony, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to correct the record on some things. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Next, I have Lauren Bone, Women's Liberation Front, virtual. Are you with us?
I am. Hi. Thank you for allowing me to testify today. My name is Lauren Bone. I am with Women's Liberation Front, WOLF, a feminist nonprofit that urges you wholeheartedly to support this bill. I am politically liberal, pro-choice. I have spent my career as an attorney fighting for women's rights, and I co-wrote this bill. They're the model legislation that it's based off of, the Women's Bill of Rights. When I was legal director of WOLF, and now I still continue to support it. Opponents want to paint the bill as a religious right-wing hit job, and that couldn't be further from the truth. This bill will protect women. It will protect marginalized women in particular, including lesbian and bisexual women and all women who do not conform with sex stereotypes. I never pictured myself going against the progressive grain on an issue like this, but I have observed personally how policies that promote gender identity over sex have hurt women and will continue to do so the more they're adopted. WOLF is representing 4 women in California prisons. I'm lead counsel on the case, helping these women challenge the prison policy that is placing biologically male offenders in with them, which is resulting in sexual assault, sexual harassment, pregnancy, physical abuse, and other things perpetrated by transfers from the men's prison. There are hundreds of transfer requests from men's facilities to women's facilities. And terrible things are happening predictably. This lawsuit is also supported by people of both sexes who identify as transgender and are formerly or currently incarcerated. If you go to WOLF's website, if you go to stopsb132.com, that's the bill number there, the former one, you can find videos, letters, audio from the women themselves talking about their experiences living under these policies. And a bill like this in Kansas can prevent some similar policies from being adopted. So people want to talk about, I'm empathetic to the concept of, or the idea, the experiences of people who have differences of sexual development, or, called intersex and other things like that. But when we're talking about ordinary, normal, not normal, but XY males, no different than any other ordinary male, they don't belong in women's prisons. And most people don't disagree with us on that. And I'm here to say you can be liberal and not do that. So I just want to say that as long as people can just stop calling it a right-wing thing, this is a nonpartisan issue, this issue of women's rights. And this is a part of women's rights. And that's how I approach it. That's how I approached it when I co-wrote the bill. And I think people should take a closer look at it instead of what people are saying about it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the proponent testimony that I have, so I'll now take questions from the committee. Questions committee, Representative Bryce.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a quick question for the virtual proponent. Let's see, Hadley Heath Manning.
Hadley, are you still with us?
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Ms. Manning. Hi, Ms. Manning. Thank you, Madam Chair. I was curious. Something struck me in your testimony where you mentioned that there was a distinct difference between sex, biological sex, and gender. And I was just I went back over the bill and I did a search, and the word gender is not in the bill. But I hear most proponents or opponents are mentioning gender as a basis for their arguments. Maybe since you brought that up, maybe it would be helpful for me. It seems like a floating definition sometimes, sex and gender. Maybe what did you mean by there's a distinct difference between biological sex and gender? Thank you.
Sure, and thank you for the question and the opportunity to clarify. Biological sex is objective. It is scientific. It is something that we can observe, and it comes down to being male or female in a biological sense. Gender identity is subjective. It is how one feels. It can be on a spectrum. It can be something that people choose. People can choose to live their lives and present in a variety of ways, to dress in a variety of ways, and that's their freedom to do so. We live in a free country. However, there are some sex-based rights that the Women's Bill of Rights would serve to fortify and protect by ensuring that when we use terms like man, woman, male, and female, we are referring to biological sex and not to gender identity. This would make it so that someone can't choose to identify as a woman and gain access to women-only spaces. However, it doesn't preclude the legislature, as I said, from also passing legislation to open up women's spaces, to make them co-ed, or to expanding the rights of people who identify as transgender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just think it's very important to keep the distinction in definitions. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Reese. I have a question for Riley Gaines.
Hi. I understand that you've been providing testimony here at the legislature a couple of times, right? I think there was a hearing in the Senate and you finished there and you came here. And I also understand you're going across the country, also pretty much saying the same thing, correct? I mean, your testimony, yeah, sharing your testimony. Okay. So since you've been doing that, I'm hoping you have some knowledge about lawsuits that might have come due to a bill like this. Are you familiar with any lawsuits that have already occurred?
Not explicitly to the Women's Bill of Rights. Oh, sorry. Not explicitly to the Women's Bill of Rights, and this might be something that Hadley or Lauren knows more on since they are more on the policy side, but I could have informed you of lawsuits that are happening on the sports side due to women missing out on opportunities because of biological men, or lawsuits of women having to share changing spaces with biological men.
Okay, thank you.
If you would like to be informed, I can inform you of a couple. Okay, thanks.
I don't need that. Thank you. I have a second question, please. This question is for, I think for Hadley. Heath Manning?
Yes. Hello.
You're online. Okay, good. Our in the bill, and I'm looking at our supplemental note. I don't know if you have a copy of that with you, other than the copy of the bill, but in the supplemental note in particular, it talks about governmental objectives of protecting the health, safety, and privacy of individuals. Where have you seen that? Where, and actually maybe that question is more for the person who actually wrote the bill with Lauren, but I'm wondering if you know what government has said that those are governmental objectives?
Sure. There's a body of case law that governs sexual discrimination, and the longstanding legal precedent requires equal treatment of similarly situated men and women, but allows differentiation between the sexes whenever privacy, safety, or equal opportunity are at stake, or when that differentiation is, quote, substantially related to an important government interest, quote. And I'm quoting from case law. There's a series of legal cases that we have followed in order to, understand what the intermediate scrutiny standard means. And when I say intermediate scrutiny, I mean it's a lower legal standard than what we apply to racial discrimination. In the cases of racial discrimination, there's little to no room for segregating people on the basis of race. However, the intermediate legal scrutiny standard established by precedent, established by case law in a variety of cases, gives us this language, gives us these reasons, tells us what the logic of the court system has been in determining cases where it is acceptable, it is not illegal, it is reasonable and good to separate people according to their sex.
And I have a second question for you, and thank you, Madam Chair, for letting me ask a second question. The next question is about, because of the separation of sexes that you think needs to happen, maybe, I think also in our bill it talks about education and for social settings. I'm wondering about, does this bill lead the way to separating girls and boys in school and teaching them differently?
So the Women's Bill of Rights simply would not require organizations to integrate boys and girls, men and women. If organizations wanted to divide on a sex basis, to have segregated, for example, if a private school wanted to be an all-girls school, or if a private school wanted to be an all-boys school, that's already clearly something that takes place in our country, and that's something that would be protected under the Women's Bill of Rights. It simply wouldn't require organizations to integrate in every setting. I hope
I'm sorry. I should have made myself clear. In individual classrooms, that girls and boys would be separated and taught differently.
So again, nothing in the Women's
to their sex.
Sure, nothing in the Women's Bill of Rights requires sex segregation. It simply precludes organizations from being forced to integrate the two sexes, if that is clear.
Well, I'm talking about education, not organizations.
Well, the education system could be an organization. I'm just trying to speak more broadly, but there's nothing in the Women's Bill of Rights that would require the education system to divide boys and girls.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, committee, are there any further questions? All right. Seeing none, I might point out, committee members, is to keep in mind in this bill that the whereas lines do not become part of the statute. So it would be below those is where the statute would begin. And also that just because it's not a major issue today, this does not mean that we wait until it becomes a major issue before it gets addressed. So at this time, committee, this concludes our hearing on Senate Bill 180, excuse me, I said House Bill, Senate Bill 180, and we will adjourn until tomorrow at 1:30.